In 2001, a team of oceanographers was mapping the seafloor off the western coast of Cuba using sonar equipment. They were not looking for a lost city. They were doing routine geological survey work. Then, one of the researchers looked at the sonar readout and called the others over. On the screen was a grid. Perfect right angles. Straight lines extending for kilometers across the ocean floor at a depth of 600 meters. Structures that the geology of that region cannot produce naturally. The team published their findings in a peer-reviewed journal. Marine geologists reviewed the data. Nobody has gone down to look yet. And what the sonar showed, sitting at the bottom of the Caribbean Sea, has never been formally explained. That is where this story begins. But it is not where it ends. Because that Cuban site is one of at least 4 locations around the world where entire cities are sitting underwater right now, and where the geology, the archaeology, and the ocean floor data all point to the same conclusion. These places were above water. People lived. Before we go to the specific sites, you need to understand one fact that changes everything about how you think about ancient history. At the peak of the last ice age, approximately 20,000 years ago, so much of the Earth's water was locked in ice sheets that global sea levels were roughly 120 meters lower than they are today. 120 meters. That is the height of a 40-story building, below current sea level. What this means in practical terms is that vast areas of land that are now underwater were above the surface, dry land, habitable land, land with rivers, with coastlines, with the kind of fertile conditions where people build settlements. The continental shelves around the world, the shallow underwater platforms that extend outward from every coastline before the seafloor drops into the deep ocean, were almost entirely above water. The land bridge connecting Asia to North America across what is now the Bering Strait was a territory the size of Australia. The North Sea between Britain and continental Europe was a landmass that archaeologists now call Doggerland, and recent surveys have found stone tools, animal bones, and evidence of human habitation across its now submerged surface. Between 20,000 years ago and approximately 7,000 years ago, the ice sheets melted. Sea levels rose by those 120 meters, but the rise was not gradual and steady. Research published in scientific journals, including Nature and Science, has documented that the sea level rise happened in pulses. Periods of relatively slow rise interrupted by sudden accelerations. Events called meltwater pulses, where the collapse of large ice sheets released enormous quantities of water into the ocean in geologically short periods. Meltwater pulse 1A, which occurred approximately 14,000 years ago, may have raised sea levels by as much as 20 meters in less than 500 years. In human terms, that is fast enough that people living on low-lying coastal land would have experienced significant flooding within their own lifetimes. Any civilization that was established on the coastal lowlands of the ancient world during the period between 20,000 and 7,000 years ago is now underwater, not metaphorically, physically, sitting on continental shelves at depths ranging from a few meters to over 100 meters below the current surface. We have barely looked. The ocean floor covering former human habitation zones represents millions of square kilometers. Systematic archaeological survey of the shallow continental shelves has covered a fraction of a percent of that area. What we have found in that fraction is already remarkable. On the northwestern coast of India, in the state of Gujarat, there is a city called Dwarka. It is one of the 7 sacred cities of Hinduism. Hindu texts describe it as the kingdom of Krishna, a magnificent city of gold and crystal built on the coast and eventually swallowed by the sea after Krishna's death. For centuries, scholars treated this as mythology, sacred story, not history. In 1988, the Marine Archaeology Unit of India began underwater excavations in the waters off the coast of modern Dwarka. What they found changed the conversation entirely. Sitting on the seafloor in the Gomati River Delta, at depths between 5 and 12 meters, they found the remains of a city. Stone walls, stone anchors, pottery, artifacts, a grid layout consistent with planned urban construction. The structures extended over a significant area of the seafloor and showed evidence of multiple periods of occupation and construction. The artifacts recovered from the site have been dated using thermoluminescence and carbon dating. The dates returned by these analyses range from approximately 7,500 years ago to 3,500 years ago, with the oldest material placing the initial construction of the site well before what conventional archaeology considers the beginning of the Indus Valley civilization. In 2002, oceanographer Graham Hancock, working with the National Institute of Ocean Technology of India, conducted sonar surveys of a broader area of the Gulf of Kambat, approximately 30 kilometers off the Gujarat coast, in water 30 to 40 meters deep. The sonar returned images of what appeared to be a large urban area, geometric structures, streets, buildings, extending over an area of approximately 9 kilometers by 2 kilometers. Dredging operations in the area brought up human bones, pottery, construction material, and a piece of wood that was carbon dated. The date returned was 9,500 years ago. If that date is accurate, this site predates the earliest known urban civilization by 4,000 years. The Gulf of Kambat site remains controversial. The Indian government has not authorized full excavation. Some researchers argue that the geometric patterns in the sonar data are natural sediment formations. Others point to the dredged artifacts, particularly the carbon-dated wood, as evidence that cannot be explained by natural geology. What is not controversial is the underwater site at Dwarka itself. The stone structures, the artifacts, the grid layout, these have been physically recovered and documented by the Marine Archaeology Unit of India in peer-reviewed publications. A city existed there. It is now underwater. The Hindu texts that described a city called Dwarka being swallowed by the sea were recording something that actually happened. In July 2001, Paulina Zalitsky and her husband Paul Weinzweig were leading an oceanographic expedition off the western tip of Cuba using advanced sonar equipment mounted on a research vessel. They were under contract to the Cuban government to survey the seafloor for geological data and to locate potential shipwreck sites. The sonar readings they obtained over a roughly 2 square kilometre area of seafloor at a depth of between 600 and 700 meters stopped the expedition. The data showed symmetrical structures, perpendicular and circular shapes, features arranged in patterns that Zalitsky, an experienced marine engineer, immediately recognized as inconsistent with natural geological formation. The team returned with a remotely operated underwater vehicle and filmed the site. The footage showed large granite-like blocks, some estimated at several meters in length, arranged in what appeared to be geometric patterns, pyramid-like formations, structures that appeared to have right angles. The team shared their findings with Cuban and Canadian scientists and published a report in the Journal of Marine and Petroleum Geology. The geological problem with the site is significant. The structures are at a depth of 600 to 700 meters. For this area to have been above sea level during the last glacial maximum, when sea levels were 120 meters lower than today, The land would have needed to be 480 to 580 meters above what was then sea level. That is a significant elevation. Not impossible, but it requires either that this was a highland area that is now submerged, or that the land itself has subsided, which can happen in geologically active areas, and the Western Caribbean is geologically active. Alternatively, if the structures are artificial and were built when the area was above sea level, they predate the last glacial maximum, placing their construction at more than 20,000 years ago. That date is far outside any conventional archaeological framework. Zilitsky and Weinsweig continue to advocate for a full scientific investigation of the site. They were not able to secure the funding and authorization required for deep-sea archaeological work, which is enormously expensive. The site has not been systematically excavated or formally classified. It remains, in the scientific literature, an anomaly. Geometric structures on the seafloor of the Caribbean, whose origin has not been determined. What the sonar showed is documented. What the ROV footage showed is documented. The question of what those structures are remains open. In 1986, a diving instructor named Kihachiro Aratake was exploring underwater near the island of Yonaguni in the Ryukyu chain of southwestern Japan. He found something in roughly 5 to 27 meters of water that he did not have a framework to understand. A massive stone structure with flat surfaces, right angles, steps, and what appeared to be terraced levels rising from the seafloor. The main formation is approximately 150 meters wide, 40 meters across, and 27 meters tall. Japanese scientists began diving the site. The debate that followed has been running for nearly 40 years and has not been fully resolved. The geological argument is that Yonaguni is a natural formation. Yonaguni sits on a type of sandstone that fractures along horizontal and vertical planes due to its crystalline structure. This natural fracturing can produce flat surfaces, right angles, and step-like formations without human intervention. The argument is that what divers see as architecture is what geology produces when the right type of rock fractures in the right conditions. The counter-argument comes from several specific features of the Yonaguni monument that are difficult to attribute to natural fracturing alone. There are what appear to be carved channels running in straight lines across flat surfaces. There is a formation that researchers have described as a stage or altar with a twin megalith standing upright on its surface. There are what appear to be post holes drilled into rock surfaces. There are carved reliefs on some faces that appear too regular to be accidental. And there is a formation that Japanese researchers have described as resembling a human face in profile. Professor Masaki Kimura of the University of the Ryukyus spent years diving the site and concluded that it is at minimum a natural formation that was modified by human hands. His argument is not that humans built it from scratch, but that they shaped, carved, and used a natural rock formation. This is a significant distinction. It places human activity at the site without requiring that humans constructed the entire structure. The age question is straightforward. The Yonaguni area was above sea level during the last glacial maximum. The site would have been dry land approximately 10,000 to 12,000 years ago. If it shows evidence of human modification, that modification occurred at least 10,000 years ago. Yonaguni draws thousands of divers every year. It has been the subject of multiple Japanese television documentaries. It has been studied by geologists and archaeologists from several countries. And the fundamental question of whether it is natural, modified natural, or constructed has not been definitively answered. Part 5. Doggerland. The world. We lost 1730 to 2100. Of all the submerged landscapes in the world, Doggerland is the one where the evidence is most complete and least disputed. It is also the one that most directly forces us to reconsider what we know about early human civilization. Doggerland was a landmass connecting what is now Britain to what is now continental Europe. It occupied the area that is today the southern North Sea. At its maximum extent, roughly 20,000 years ago, it was larger than the United Kingdom. It had rivers, it had hills, it had coastlines, it had forests, wetlands, and the kind of diverse ecology that would have been extraordinarily rich for hunter-gatherer and early agricultural populations. We know this because fishermen have been pulling things up from the North Sea floor for over a century. Animal bones, stone tools, a carved antler artifact known as the barbed point that is 11,740 years old, pieces of peat from ancient land surfaces, human remains. In 1931, a fishing boat operating in the Liman and Oa Banks area brought up a lump of peat in its nets. Inside the peat was a barbed bone point of a type used by Mesolithic hunters. It had been lying on what was once a land surface, preserved in waterlogged peat for nearly 12,000 years. Since then, systematic dredging and more recently systematic archaeological survey of the North Sea floor has produced a picture of Doggerland that becomes more detailed every year. Scientists from the University of Bradford, the University of Birmingham, and multiple European institutions have been mapping the submerged landscape using seismic survey data originally collected by the oil and gas industry. The picture that emerges is of a populated, ecologically rich landmass that was home to Mesolithic communities for thousands of years before the sea took it. The end of Doggerland came in stages. Rising sea levels progressively reduced the landmass over thousands of years, turning hills into islands, flooding river valleys, pushing populations toward higher ground. The final event may have been sudden. Around 8,200 years ago, a massive underwater landslide off the coast of Norway, called the Storegga Slide, generated a tsunami that swept across the remnants of Doggerland. Any communities still living on the last low-lying areas of the landmass would have experienced this as a catastrophe within hours. The descendants of the people who lived in Doggerland are the people of Britain and Northern Europe. They carry the memory of their drowned homeland in the flood myths that appear in virtually every culture across the region. The story of a great flood that destroyed a world. The story of land swallowed by the sea. These stories are not purely mythological. They are the cultural memory of something that actually happened, preserved across hundreds of generations because it was so catastrophic that it could not be forgotten. Here is what these four sites, Dwarka, the Cuban anomaly, Yonaguni, and Doggerland, have in common. They all existed above sea level during periods when we believe human populations were present. They all show evidence, at varying levels of certainty, of human presence or activity. They all now sit underwater, and they all represent a category of archaeological site that we have barely begun to investigate systematically. The conventional timeline of human civilization begins with Mesopotamia and Egypt around 3000 to 4000 BCE. But the continental shelves that were above water between 20,000 and 7,000 years ago represent millions of square kilometers of former human habitat. The people who lived there, built there, and were displaced by rising seas left evidence of their existence on the seafloor. We have found fragments of that evidence at Dwarka and in the North Sea and off the coast of Japan and Cuba. What we have not done is look seriously and systematically at the rest of it. The technology exists. autonomous underwater vehicles, high-resolution sonar, advanced diving equipment, and remote sensing tools that can survey large areas of seafloor quickly and cheaply compared to what was possible even 10 years ago. The will and the funding to use those tools on the submerged continental shelves has not yet materialized at the scale the question deserves. The history of human civilization may begin not in Mesopotamia, but on coastlines and river deltas that are now 50 or 100 meters below the surface of the ocean. The flood myths found in over 200 separate cultures around the world, including the stories that became the biblical account of Noah, may be the oldest historical records we have, preserved not in writing, but in oral tradition across hundreds of generations, because the events they describe were real. The ocean took those worlds, but it preserved them too, and we are only now beginning to understand how to ask it what it is keeping down there. Subscribe, because the next discovery on this channel is one the textbooks have not written yet.